James Allen's As a Man Thinketh, 1903, historical context and long-term relevance. Setting the stage, Britain in 1903 and the New Thought movement. In the year 1903, Edwardian Britain stood at the cusp of modernity while still echoing Victorian values. It was a time of rapid social change in the wake of the Industrial Revolution. Factories had transformed cities, a new urban working class had emerged, and progressive movements for labor rights and education were underway. Amid these post-industrial changes, there remained a strong cultural emphasis on moral character and self-improvement, a legacy of the Victorian era. Victorian morality famously extolled personal virtues like hard work, perseverance, thrift, and self-reliance as the key to bettering one's lot. The best-selling self-help book of the mid-19th century, Samuel Smiles' Self-Help, 1859, had epitomized this ethic by trumpeting the virtues of hard work, perseverance, and commitment at an individual level. Shifting focus from collective circumstances to personal accountability, by the turn of the 20th century, this outlook that character and personal effort determine one's destiny was deeply ingrained in mainstream British thought. At the same time, new currents of thought were flowing across the Atlantic. The New Thought movement, which had originated in late 19th century America, was gaining adherents internationally, including in Britain. New Thought was a metaphysical and spiritual movement premised on the bold idea that thoughts could directly affect reality, that right thinking could heal, prosper, and transform one's life. Pioneered by figures like Phineas P. Quimby in the U.S., New Thought teachings emphasized a power of positive thinking, the use of affirmations and mental healing techniques. By 1900 to 1903, these ideas had spread through lectures, journals, and books, not only in America, but also in Britain and beyond. Many followers of New Thought considered themselves Christian, blending religious faith with mind-healing principles. This was an era when people were seeking practical spirituality, a way to reconcile the scientific progress of the age with enduring spiritual yearnings. In church and meeting halls, a mind cure culture was arising, encouraging individuals to harness thought and mental discipline to improve their health and circumstances. It was in this fertile environment, a Britain straddling its traditional moral code and new metaphysical ideas, that James Allen wrote and published As a Man Thinketh. Allen, an Englishman from a working class background, absorbed both the Victorian faith in self-help and the New Thought belief in mind power. When he brought out this slim volume in 1903, he was speaking to the concerns of his time. How an ordinary person might rise above hardship and shape their own destiny through the power of thought. The book's very title, As a Man Thinketh, comes from the Bible. Proverbs 23:7. As a man thinketh in his heart, so is he. Immediately rooting it in familiar Christian context. Yet the message Allen delivered was in many ways novel for its day. He suggested that the mind is the ultimate shaper of character and circumstance, writing that in his own thought world, each man holds the key to every condition, good or bad, that enters into his life. And by mastering thoughts, one can remake his life and transform his circumstances. Such ideas resonated with the optimistic spirit of the early 20th century, even as they gently challenged the era's more conventional notions of success being determined by external fate or social station. Christian, classical, and literary influences on Allen, James Allen, did not invent his philosophy in a vacuum. As a Man Thinketh emerged from a rich tapestry of intellectual and cultural influences that shaped Allen's world view. Foremost among these was Christianity. Allen was raised in England where the Bible was a moral compass for society, and his writings are imbued with biblical language and concepts. The very premise that thought precedes action and character reflects a biblical moral order: as one sows, so shall one reap. Allen's emphasis on virtue, purity, and faith owes much to the Christian tradition of self examination and moral uplift. His book frequently invokes ideals of wisdom, blessedness, and divine perfection, echoing Christian ethics even as it presents them in a practical secular tone. In one of his later writings, Allen's wife Lily noted that his literary mission was essentially spiritual. He wrote when he had a message only after living out and proving his principles in practice. This reflects a profoundly Christian ethos of integrity. Truth must be lived, not just preached. At the same time, Allen drew on classical Stoicism and other ancient philosophies that stress mastery over one's own mind. Though he seldom quoted Stoic authors explicitly, the parallels are striking. The Roman emperor philosopher Marcus Aurelius once wrote, "The soul becomes dyed with the color of its thoughts," encapsulating the life. Allen's entire essay builds on this premise. His assertion that a man is literally what he thinks, his character being the complete sum of all his thoughts, could have come from Epictetus or Seneca as easily as from a New Testament epistle. The Stoics taught self-control, virtue, and inner tranquility in the face of life's vicissitudes, themes that Allen passionately reiterates. For example, Allen's idea that calmness is power and that serenity comes from right thinking aligns with Stoic teachings about equanimity. We know that late Victorian educators often introduced students to the classics. It is likely Allen encountered Stoic ideas through cultural osmosis, if not formal study. His work serves as a bridge between ancient wisdom and modern self-help, reframing timeless advice on governing one's thoughts in a simple, relatable way for the everyman. Allen was also indebted to the 19th century self-help literature that preceded him. As mentioned, Samuel Smiles' self-help was a publishing phenomenon in England, by some accounts second only to the Bible in popularity in its time. Smiles and his Victorian contemporaries promoted the gospel of personal improvement. Biographies of great men, aphorisms about diligence and character, and a conviction that anyone could rise from humble origins through effort and integrity. Allen, born in 1864 to a struggling family in Leicester, was very much a product of this culture. In fact, his own life story mirrored a classic Victorian rags to responsibility arc. As a teenager, Allen had to leave school and work in factory offices after his father's tragic death, scratching out a living in industrial England. He educated himself in his spare time. This background gave Allen a deep empathy for strivers of modest means and a belief. Typical of Victorian liberalism, that character was the decisive factor in one's fate. He thus extolled habits like industry, honesty, and focused ambition, much as Smiles had done a generation earlier. But Allen's innovation was to add a metaphysical dimension, where a Victorian moralist might say, work hard and be virtuous. Allen would add, because your thoughts create your reality. In this way, as a man thinketh, both upheld Victorian ideals and transcended them, injecting the power of mind into the established narrative of self-help. Less obvious, but equally important, were Allen's encounter with Eastern and humanistic philosophies. By the early 1900s, translations of Buddhist and Hindu texts were available in English and had sparked interest among Western spiritual seekers. James Allen proved to be an avid seeker. As one historian notes, Allen drank deeply from Eastern spirituality. He was among the first Westerners to popularize principles of Buddhism. From American motivational and mind power philosophy and the rock-ribbed moralism of Victorian England. Indeed, Allen's writing stressed mindfulness and the cultivation of inner peace in a way that resonates with Buddhism. His call for complete responsibility over one's own thoughts parallels the Buddha's teachings that all that we are is the result of what we have thought. Moreover, Allen's gentle, almost aesthetic personal life, he eventually withdrew to a quiet village in Ilfracombe to write, living simply with his wife, was reminiscent of Tolstoy and Buddhist ideals. Contemporary accounts describe Allen as a kind of mystic of everyday life. He eschewed fame and materialism, aiming instead to master all of the virtues and live in harmony with the law of love. Like the Russian novelist Tolstoy, in his later years, Allen practiced voluntary simplicity, a life of few possessions, manual work, gardening, and chores, and compassion towards all creatures. Allen was reportedly a vegetarian who would not harm even a mouse. This meddling of East and West in Allen's influences gave As a Man Thinketh a unique universalist flavor. The book draws on Christian morality, Stoic self-discipline, and New Thought optimism, but also radiates a serene, almost Buddhist faith in the law of cause and effect in the moral universe. Within the beyond mainstream thought of its time, when As a Man Thinketh was published, it both reflected and departed from the mainstream thought of its era. On one hand, Allen's core message would have sounded familiar and respectable to an early 20th century reader steeped in Victorian and Christian teachings. His insistence on personal responsibility for one's condition, the idea that our thoughts and character are one, strongly echoed the Victorian moral maxim that individuals largely shape their own destiny through character and conduct. In society that valued self-reliance, this was a reassuring affirmation that the old virtues still mattered. Allen's writings is earnest and exhortative, much like a sermon or a morality tract. He speaks of honesty, purpose, goodness, and self-discipline as the foundations of a well-lived life. Such language was very much in line with the moral mainstream of the time. Even the book's small, unadorned format, Allen called it a pocket companion for thoughtful people, priced at 1 shilling, suggested he intended it for a broad audience, including working class readers who were accustomed to pamphlets or on self-improvement Yet, in other respects, Allen's philosophy stood a little to the side of the early 20th century mainstream thought, almost quiet revolutionary. Consider the prevailing intellectual currents of the day. The early 1900s were marked by growing faith in science, the influence of social Darwinism, and the onset of modern psychology. Many learned people were beginning to attribute human behavior to hereditary environment or the subconscious rather than individual will. Socialist ideas about class condition and economic structures determining one's fate were also gaining ground in the Edwardian Britain. In this context, Allen's declaration that thoughts are the supreme factor in shaping one's reality was a departure from the norm. He was in effect reasserting idealism in the age tilting toward material explanations. As a Man Thinketh posits an almost absolute inner freedom. Regardless of one's external circumstances, one can think oneself into or out of virtuous character, health, and prosperity. This was not a common view among Orthodox thinkers. Traditional Christianity, for example, emphasized human sinfulness and reliance on God's grace. Allen, by contrast, emphasizes human mental agency and divine potential within. Likewise, where social reformers of the time focused on external remedies for poverty and vice, better wages, housing, education, Allen unabashedly asserts that poverty or prosperity spring from a man's mindset above all, a notion some would have seen as too individualistic or even blaming the victim. It is fair to say that James Allen occupied a middle ground between conventional morality and radical New Thought. He did not go as far as some New Thought writers who promised near magical results, wealth, or miraculous healing purely from the thought of faith. Allen's tone is more sober and ethical. Thoughts must be aligned with duty and virtue to yield happy and beautiful issues. He maintained this emphasis kept him within the comfort zone of many Christian readers. Still, by treating mind as the motor of fate, Allen subtly challenged the era's fatalism. His book suggested that the common man had more power than he realized, that each person is the master gardener of his soul, planting seeds of thought that bloom into destiny. In doing so, Allen's work departed from the class-bound thinking of his society, where it was often assumed one's station in life was fixed, and from the emergent scientific skepticism about metaphysical concepts. If mainstream academic opinion in 1903 largely ignored as a Man Thinketh, it was too folksy and mystical to attract scholarly notice. The book, nevertheless, found a respective fringe audience. It circulated among spiritual seekers, temperance advocates, and self-improvement circles who were open to the blend of old-fashioned virtue and newfangled mental science. Over time, what was once a fringe idea, the law of the mind as a literal force in life, would seep into popular culture, vindicating Allen's forward-looking stance. In the short term, however, As a Man Thinketh remained somewhat out of place in its era, a quietly prophetic text awaiting a future audience that could fully appreciate it. From obscurity to inspiration. The book's reception and legacy. James Allen published As a Man Thinketh with the modest exceptions. In fact, the book almost didn't see the light of day. Allen initially underestimated his own work. According to one account, he was actually dissatisfied with the manuscript, and it was his wife, Lily, who had persuaded him to publish it. Allen failed to recognize that this concise essay, which so carefully distilled his philosophy would become his masterpiece. Upon its release in 1903, As a Man Thinketh did not make a grand splash. It found a small but steady readership, enough that Allen was encouraged to continue writing and even quit his day job to pursue a literary career. Still, during Allen's lifetime, he remained far from a household name. He received little fame or fortune. But all accounts, he lived simply and quietly, pleased more by the personal letters and thanks he got from readers than by any public recognition. One early 20th century observer called Allen a literary mystery man. His books touched many lives, yet the author himself stayed almost unknown. He produced a remarkable stream of nearly 19 books in 9 years, then died in 1912 at the age of 47, largely eulogized only in niche spiritual journals. It was in the decades after his death that As a Man Thinketh steadily gained a cult following and then entered the mainstream of inspirational literature. The book benefited from being in the public domain due to its age, which allowed it to be reprinted widely and cheaply throughout the mid-20th century as the positive thinking movement surged. Allen's words found new life. By the 1920s, Western culture had increasingly embraced the idea of practical self-improvement undergirded by spiritual principles. Historians note that by the 1920s, spiritual self-help promoted in books such as James Allen's As a Man Thinketh led congregants to desire a useful from their faith, fueling a rise in organizations that combine scientific psychology, self-help method, and religious ideas. In other words, ordinary churchgoers wanted techniques to improve their daily lives, prosperity, health, confidence, not just promises of heaven. Allen's little book, with its clear assurance that each man holds the key to every condition in his own thought world, fit perfectly into the trend. It became, as one writer put it, an informal model for the burgeoning self-help movement. Motivational thinkers in America were especially influenced by it. For example, Napoleon Hill, author of Think and Grow Rich, 1937, and Norman Vincent Powell, author of The Power of Positive Thinking in 1952, are often cited as having drawn inspiration from James Allen's work. Hill's famous dictum, "What you think, so you become," is essentially an expansion of Allen's core premise. Indeed, Allen today is recognized as a pioneer whose shoulders many later self-help giants stood upon. Over the 20th century, As a Man Thinketh was mass-produced and globally dismantled, achieving a readership far beyond anything James Allen saw in his lifetime. Its reception evolved from quiet appreciation to almost scriptural status in the self-improvement canon. By the late 20th and early 21st century, the book had been translated into numerous languages and was being handed out in seminars, quoted in motivational speeches, and included in analogies of great inspirational writings. Modern personal development gurus routinely praise its simplicity and timeless wisdom, while some contemporary readers might find the Edwardian prose a bit antiquated or the outlook naively optimistic. The consensus is that As a Man Thinketh captured a fundamental truth about human nature that transcends its time. The phrase, "As you think, so shall you become," popularized by Allen and derived from biblical and classical sources, has entered the cultural lexicon as a shorthand for the power of mindset. Crucially, Allen's work helped shape the genre of modern motivational literature. Many of the now familiar tropes of self-help writing, the call to take personal responsibility, the assurance that changing one's thoughts can change one's life, the blend of ethical guidance with practical advice, were distilled in As a Man Thinketh. Later, authors expanded on these ideas, applying them to wealth, relationships, leadership, and beyond. But the heart of it remains Allen's insight that everything begins with a thought. As one review of the positive thinking movement notes, by mid-century, the notion of harnessing thoughts had entered the mainstream of American life, influencing business, psychology, and even politics. We see this legacy in the success of countless books and programs that echo Allen's philosophy, from self-esteem curricula in schools to cognitive behavior techniques and therapy that teach people to reframe negative thinking. More than 120 years after its publication, As a Man Thinketh continues to be rediscovered by new generations. Its longevity can be contributed to its brevity and depth. It is easily read in an afternoon, yet invites a long time of reflection. The book's narrative of empowerment that each person, by mastering their inner world, can rise above external trials, remains deeply relevant in our modern era of uncertainty. If Allen's language belongs to 1903, his message certainly does not. In the end, As a Man Thinketh has proven to be both a product of its historical moment and a timeless beacon, grounded in the bedrock of Victorian virtue of Christian wisdom, informed by new thought and ancient philosophy. James Allen's little volume became a foundational text of personal development. Its journey from a quiet English printing to a worldwide inspirational classic illustration, a profound point